Falling prices. That sounds like a pretty great concept, right? Making the Bitcoin in your virtual wallet or the dollars in your actual wallet stretch further. But regular listeners to this pod know that in economics, things aren't necessarily straightforward. And falling prices, or deflation to give it its technical term, can be a sign of an economy in trouble. China is on track for the longest deflation streak since Mao Zedong's 1960s Great Leap Forward plunged the country into recession and famine. All while the rest of us deal with inflationary pressures and the fear of more to come because of tariffs. So what does China's prolonged cycle of deflation mean for the world's second largest economy? And can it escape it? We thought we'd find out. It's what we do here on Reuters Econ World. Every week, we pick a phrase or buzzword and go deep on the economic principles and ideas driving the biggest news around the world. So this week, China's price problem. I'm your host, Carmel Crimmins, in Dublin. Deflation isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes prices fall because of increased productivity and technological improvements. But deflation can also be triggered by a fall in demand, and that's bad. Because once prices start dropping because of weak demand, then consumers and businesses may be put off spending because they expect prices to fall further. Deferring consumption like that depresses economic activity. It hurts profits and means businesses may have to cut staff and wages, and that means more price cuts. What you have then is a downward spiral. Think the United States during the Great Depression, or Japan until very recently. In China, prices have been falling for 2 years. China didn't have the big price jump that other economies experienced when it reopened after the COVID-19 pandemic. Instead, a real estate slump and a government crackdown on the tech and finance industries hurt consumer confidence, putting people off spending. And now rising tariffs are dimming the prospects for its all-important export sector. So where does that leave China? To find out, I called up Antoni Slodkowski, our Chief Correspondent for China. Antoni, I'm delighted to have you joining me here today.
Glad to be here.
What is it like being in China right now? What is it like living in an economy where prices are falling? Like the whole concept of that is just hard to wrap our head around elsewhere in the world, where all we do is complain about rising prices.
Right. I mean, for consumers, this is pretty good as long as you have money in your pocket.
Right.
You know, you have flash sales in stores. Very popular in China are these e-commerce platforms. Obviously, everybody knows Alibaba, but there is a plethora of other platforms out there. So you can, at your fingertips, have order a meal home for, $1 or $2. I'm ashamed to say, but I was working late last night and, I was tired this morning and I just took a cab to work today. And it cost me for a 10-kilometer ride, something like $3.50, $4 in rush hour.
I don't even think that would get you to the end of the road in Dublin.
Yeah, but I think so people who are well off, like for them, that's really great.
Yeah.
But there is a really big subset of people who are, even with such low prices, struggling to make ends meet, So it sounds great, but I think what it's like for people whose wages aren't growing, or in fact, whose wages are falling, that is really the key question here, because I think wage growth is a really important component to sort of trying to prevent this vicious cycle of this deflationary cycle that China is sort of at the risk of sort of falling into.
As you mentioned, in theory,
yeah,
great if you're a consumer and have money in your pockets, right? You're getting bargains. But in the main, this is not seen as a good look for the Chinese economy, right? There are big risks with prices continuing to fall. Does the government talk about deflation? Does it talk about falling prices?
So we've just kind of concluded China's annual parliament, where the economy was the number one topic, but the word deflation did not feature in this very long report anywhere.
So, what are they doing to try and get consumer confidence motoring again and therefore directly get those prices rising again?
I think until sort of middle to the end of last year, the government wasn't really even talking so much about the importance of consumption. And over the last, I would say, 6 months or so, we've seen a really dramatic shift, at least when it comes to the rhetoric, which is obviously the first step. So they've recognized that not only investment in manufacturing and production and all of that is important, but actually you need to help consumers feel more confident to actually buy stuff. The problem is that, to be able to do that, people would have to feel more confident that, there isn't another crisis around the corner, that they won't have to save a lot of money, for example, for a big hospital bill.
Right.
And that requires really deep structural reforms that I think experts are saying, China is really reluctant to do. So I think there are some initial steps. There is definitely recognition that things need to be done. There's been this cash for clunkers sort of trade-in scheme for old devices and other things. So it's sort of this trade-in scheme for appliances. You can trade in your old appliances or devices or stuff, and that's in theory supposed to stimulate consumption.
It feels like there's kind of tinkering around the edges then, right? Like it's interesting, China being, at least on paper, a communist country. It's sort of surprising when you dig in to find that actually the social security net is not that deep, right? Like the state pension is very low, unemployment benefit. People save here because the state doesn't provide for them, right?
Precisely. That is the crux of the matter. So people were really badly hit with the housing crisis, and a lot of the households' sort of savings and a lot of the household wealth is tied up in that, so much so that housing is and real estate is sort of a quarter of China's economy, right?
Right.
So that really was a major hit to people's pockets and to their confidence. And it's also not a type of investment you can quickly liquidate. So people have lost a lot of confidence. They have lost a lot of money. And apart from that, just like you said, there isn't really anything else. So the health insurance system doesn't really work super well. The state pensions are really low. So people really need to kind of be careful what they spend their money on. And then on top of that, you have this Mao era system of internal, sort of like this internal passport system. So for example, there are a lot of people here in Beijing who drive these motorcycles, who are these like delivery drivers, but they're very often not from here and they're unable to obtain permanent residency here. So they're pretty poor. And they're saving a ton because they're unable to even obtain the kind of benefits that the residents of Beijing are able to get. And so you have these citizens of the second category living in big cities who are also not spending.
Right.
So that is also another sort of drag on the economy, on consumption.
So kind of like an urban-rural divide, but within big cities.
Yeah, so you have a lot of migrant workers, internal migrants who work in big cities, but whose ability to save and ability to obtain sort of the benefits that actual residents of Beijing or Shanghai can get is very limited. For example, they can't settle here and send their children to Beijing schools because they don't have the household registration here. So this is a huge, huge drag on consumption that the economists have been talking about forever. And it's being relaxed very gradually, but there has been no bold, dramatic structural reforms that are required to actually change the situation here.
Why isn't the government taking this big, bold structural action?
I think it's because it's hard. Because there isn't really, if you want to grow 5% on the one hand, every year, and then on the other hand, if you were to build out the safety net, if you were to invest in hospitals, if you were to invest in pensions, that growth would disappear. So I think it's a really complicated, difficult thing. And China is still dealing with the fallout from the housing crisis, and they're still trying to untangle that disaster. So there is that. And then I think there is also like a mindset issue as well, I think, so I think when we speak to people off the record and in private conversations with officials, quite often they're just a little bit like, I think there is like this very old school mentality that like making things makes sense versus, and like they don't understand what's so good about people going to a spa. How is that How is that productive? What is that about?
That it almost feels slightly frivolous to be basing an economy on consumption. Is that what you kind of mean? Is that the sort of sense that you're picking up?
Partly, but then you also have to ask yourself a question, okay, so what is this manufacturing boom built on? And obviously, a lot of that is built on ingenuity. It's a lot of that is built on incredible hard work of the Chinese people, but it's also built on low wages. And it's not just low wages of laborers, but it's also low wages of people like electric vehicle engineers. They're very cheap in China to hire.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about boosting consumption, you have kind of contradictory vectors here as well. And I don't think the Chinese are really prepared to make those bold changes yet.
You mentioned the property sector. One aspect of deflation, which is there is a certain group of people that it definitely doesn't benefit them, and that's people who owe money. Your borrowings become more burdensome when prices are falling. Is that a problem for the government then as they try to unwind from this property crash?
The challenge is enormous, and it's not just obviously you mentioned borrowing and sort of what happens with that when prices fall, but there's also questions of fixed cost, sort of fixed income investments. A lot of the apartments are half built, a lot of them are rotting in the wind and snow, and now you need to think about, okay, well, are we taking them down, are we tearing them down, because they're not livable anymore. They've been out and unfinished for 3-4 years. You're done. You may have built a small city that's empty, and now what do you do with that? That's another cost that you need to kind of think about as well.
Wow.
So these costs and the hidden costs and the unresolved problems are tremendous, and a lot of them are shouldered by local governments, not the national government as well.
So it's not hard to see why people want to squirrel away their money. They don't feel comfortable spending. And of course, all this is coming at a time when we've got this trade war.
Absolutely.
How's that playing into this deflationary spiral?
Oh, I mean, I think this is behind the government. The government did, everybody was saying you need to shift towards at least recognizing that consumption is important in China. That happened as a result of the Trump threats, because, like you say, the engine of growth that has been sort of mostly centered around exports is sort of now very severely undermined, right? And it has come under tremendous attack, not just by Trump, but also by other countries that are worried about China's manufacturing overcapacity. So shift to consumption is sort of like one very visible outcome of what's going on with trade and with Trump. Number two is China is making pretty clear overtures to Europe. And it's clear that these conversations are happening because China is still trying to preserve its access to at least the European market.
Mm-hmm.
So that is also another very clear outcome of the Trump trade war, or the tariffs that he has imposed so far.
But that trade war, it really prevents companies in China from even attempting to raise prices at home, right? They can't really get into raising prices at home because, they can't rely on their home market. They're really quite stuck, aren't they?
Absolutely. There's been this tremendous state-led investment in anything from solar panels to EVs, and that has led to incredible growth and robust price competition domestically. And this overcapacity has nowhere else to go. There are no other markets. That's why there is such big push to preserve at least the European market. And domestically, this has led to huge price wars. That's why we have these $16,000, $17,000 vehicles available on the market, and that's why these prices are so low domestically.
To find a real-world example of the damage caused by China's deflation spiral, we start in an alleyway in Beijing, and large equipment being removed from a restaurant. It's an area of the city where once crowded eateries fill the street. Now kitchen equipment salesman An Dawei is overseeing the dismantling of another failed business. He tells us the Japanese restaurant being cleared has been dismantled before. An's team is known in Beijing's food and beverage industry as the restaurant undertaker. Last year, it dismantled 200 restaurants each month. That's nearly 4 times more than the year before. Behind many of the failed restaurants are people who bet their life savings on an economic recovery after the pandemic. Anne says instead they saw consumers skimp on eating out as China's economy slowed. And cutthroat competition to attract diners has left many struggling for survival. Across China, the number of dissolved catering companies has reached a historic high of almost 3 million. So, and some economists see China in danger of sliding into the kind of, multi-decade battle against deflation and weak growth that Japan suffered in the 1990s and the 2000s. What does your reporting show? Is that a real risk?
Yeah, I think the risk is definitely very serious. I would just point out three differences between China and Japan, and that is that Japan's asset bubble burst in 1989 when Japan has already attained a robust middle class, and it was a pretty wealthy country at that time. And there are many places in China that are still very poor, and the income here per capita is not at all as high. So I think that's number one. Number two, I would say that the healthcare system in Japan is really great. It's affordable and it's accessible to most citizens. And three, it's the pension system. Again, Japan can boast it. So you have
right.
You are falling into in China. You're falling into this deflationary spiral, and there is this threat of Japanification. But the citizens here are not at all at the same sort of level of wealth, and they don't have as robust and a sort of a social net as people in Japan have. So I think those are like pretty big risks that are unique to China. And there's also one other aspect that's very scary, and that's the consequence of the one-child policy. Again, that's a uniquely Chinese element, but
right.
the population here is falling. And so you also have that aspect. And then the number of marriages. China is still very much the society where, people typically get married when they're starting a family, and the number of marriages is also on the downward trajectory. So those are all indicators that, China is still pretty far away from resolving its issues with deflation.
A big thank you to Ant and everyone who covers China at Reuters. Sound design, music composition, and engineering on this episode was by Alex Summer. Our podcast team includes Kim Vanell, Tara Oakes, Gail Issa, Christopher Walljasper, Jonah Green, David Spencer, and Sharon Reich-Garson. Our executive producer is Lila de Kretzer. Remember, for all your daily news, check out our weekday show, Reuters World News. You can catch it on the Reuters app or wherever you listen to your podcasts.